Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this video you have my next recent reads vlog, and I have 3 books to update about. 2 I have physically, 1 I do not. So I'm going to start with the one that I finished first out of those, and that's one that I read as an e-arc on my Kindle. I read it mostly on the trip back from Houston on Monday, so at the time of the closing clip of the last vlog I had already read it, but I wrapped up only books that I had read up until Sunday and saved this book to open up Mondays. And that is the book Boomie's Boombox. This is a book that I had requested so long ago that I didn't remember anything about it. I just knew it was one of the earliest ones. I think it was published in March or May of last year, and I didn't look up anything about it before I started reading it. It also didn't have necessarily the most eye-catching cover. You're not supposed to judge books by their cover, but of course, we all do. But I started reading this one and immediately I knew that this was going to be a good read. It opens up with the main character, Boomie, she's auditioning to become like the next level at her ballet studio. So I think at 12 or whatever, they audition to become part of the actual company and continue studying ballet. But it's not about the audition itself. She's talking about and catching the reader up on everything that's happened in her life. And I don't remember, I think this is set sometime mid-2021. So it's still in the pandemic, but after the height of it. She has been affected significantly by it because her father was a medical professional. I don't remember whether he was a doctor or a nurse, but he passed away from the disease. And so she's had time since then to both have to process and not process well the death of her father, lockdown, somewhat losing her friendship because of the separation, how that is processed, and also how she's processing the grief and the fact that like she's eating more and she doesn't look exactly like what she used to when her ballet studio met in person, because this is one of the first times they've met in person. In that opening chapter, it was just written so well that I was hooked immediately. I did not know that this got into time travel though. And that's the boombox part of it. And I'm not going to say anything else about that. But when that thing happened, I was like, oh, so we're going there. And it could have been a gimmick. It could have not worked. But the author, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, did a really good job in how she integrated the time travel aspect, never fully explaining it. Most time travel books don't explain it. I mean, look at Doctor Who. They tried to explain time travel. Does it actually work? Of course not. But anyway, I really enjoyed the aspect of this because the time travel enables Boomie to learn more about her father and her father's side of the family. And it feels almost a little surreal, almost like you're in the town from, I think it's like Flashdance or Saturday Night Fever, whatever the movie. I haven't seen it, but it's the one where they can't dance because it's evil and someone goes in and basically starts a revolution or whatever. I don't remember which one it is. I think Saturday Night Fever. But anyway, it feels like one of those towns with all of those rigid rules about everything. And it is a little bit towards the like microaggressions and racism in England because Boomie and her family are Indian. They live in the San Francisco area. Boomie is American, like she was born in the US, but her parents were both born in England and their parents were born in India. It's a very complicated web of a story, but it was just so wholesome to read and I thoroughly enjoyed it. The audiobook that I was reading, that I started I read most of it during the marathon itself, hadn't quite finished it, had about 4 to 6 hours left. I don't remember how much, because this is quite a thick book. And then I ended up finishing it last night. I had like half an hour or so to finish last night. And this book took me by surprise. I've already added it to my bookshop wish list. The Pomegranate Gate. This is one that I had as an arc as well, because I was trying to read books that I had arcs of. That's one of my goals for my TBR this month. So I had heard Becca from Becca in the Books talk about this and talk about what she liked about it and how intrigued she was by it. I don't necessarily always align with her fantasy tastes, but that's still like hooked into my brain a little bit, and so I was intrigued about it, and that's why I chose to pick up this one as the audiobook that I was reading on the trip And she was right. This is a fascinating take on fantasy because this is set in a fantastical world. It's not straight historical fantasy, but this fantastical world is based heavily on Renaissance, medieval-ish Spain, the time of the Reconquista and the Spanish Inquisition. But it's a fictional world. And the author does such a good job with that. You've got characters who are Jewish. I don't know if she uses the word Jewish for it, but that's clearly the mythology that it's drawing on. And there's also a fantastical world with the Mazics, and I don't know exactly what mythology that is drawing on, but it's somewhere in maybe Moorish, because you get that influence a lot in Spain, especially in southern Spain. This was just absolutely fascinating. It's basically a dual perspective story, two main storylines, and they converge a few times. So I was confused at the beginning because I wasn't keeping some of the names straight. There were a lot of names. Once I got that all sorted out, it's no issue. You have the two main protagonists who lead these storylines. One is Toba and the other is Naphtali. They are from the same town. The Inquisition is coming. They have to convert or leave. They choose to leave, but Toba ends up accidentally knocked off the path or something because she is not necessarily looked on with a lot of respect because she's very unique. She can talk, but she can't shout. She can walk, but she can't run. It turns out that that's really a key thing, aspect about her. And she ends up on this caravan and gets pushed off the road. Naphtali sees it, tries to go after her, but she ends up in a magical world. And he sees her go off in there and he's like, oh no, this is a problem. Ends up connecting with this old woman. And literally, she's never named. She's always called the old woman. She never gives her name. She is my favorite character. I love her so much. Snarky, but loyal. Fantastic. And also, Toba's grandmother, Elena. And that's one line. They're trying to get Toba back. They don't realize what's happened to her. Although Elena may know more than she's letting on. Toba, on the other hand, ends up in this fantastical world, fully immersed in learning very interesting things about herself, and then gets swept up in a political plot line that is reminiscent in the fantastical world of the actual world. And it's just engrossing. There's so much that happens in this book. I mean, clearly it's long, but I was engaged throughout the entire story. I loved it from beginning to end. Cannot wait for the sequel. I know it's going to take a while because this just came out spring-ish of 2023, but this is phenomenal. It's got enough of classic fantasy tropes that I love, but also it is very unique in a lot of the storytelling aspects. Phenomenal. The other audiobook that I finished, because it's shorter, so I had like half an hour or so of Pomegranate Gate to finish, I picked up book 2 in the Sisters Grimm series. I don't remember anything about book 1. I read it a while ago. You don't need to remember anything about book 1. This is basically cozy mystery that's middle grade and also fairy tales. Once upon a time, basically, for middle graders. This is so fun, so wholesome. I loved the characters. I loved the sister dynamics. Daphne, the younger sister, is a hoot. Love her so much. The interaction between the grandmother and the two granddaughters. So the scenario in here is that all of these, what they call ever afters, had to leave Europe and they were resettled in America, but they can't just go off and roam all around the world. So the brothers Grimm, the ancestors of the sisters Grimm of this story, basically set up a spell around the town where they can't leave. Remind you of Once Upon a Time? Slightly different scenario. The spell is broken only when there is no living member of the Grimm family. And so the relationships between the Grimms and the Ever Afters, they work together a lot, but it's also tense because some of the Ever Afters want to leave. And that becomes a recurring plot line. And I think in the first book, you're introduced to these sisters who know nothing about their magical past because their parents, her father is a Grimm, mother married into the family. He raised them outside of this fairy tale world, didn't let them read fairy tales, anything. But then they go missing. and are presumed dead. So the girls end up in the foster care system, family to family, until their grandmother finds them and they learn all about fairy tales. Well, the older sister, who is 6th grade age, is still trying to find their parents. Like they all are, but she's the most dedicated towards it. And so that's also another underlying plot line. And this just was a fun story that I just really enjoyed. It's very episodic. I know I will enjoy the other 8 episodes that I have left to read of this. Maybe one month I'll binge them all. Who knows? The book that I started is book 3 of the Mowendale Mysteries. I was able to get a copy of the 4th and final one on audiobook, so I will still try to finish that series. I had thought that book 3 finished it, book 4 actually finishes it, and I want to finish a series. Okay, so I've not been all that great at filming updates after I finished individual books. I have 4 books to talk about. I'm pretty sure, never mind, I have 5 books to talk about. I have to go grab the 5th one. I just have not gotten around to the filming. I've been in a little bit of a content creation slump. I think I probably did that to myself with all of the videos that I did in December. It's also been a little bit of a reading funk. So working through all of that, probably I could have read more books over this time period. And yes, I admit that when you look at the number of books that I read, most people don't read this many books. But for me, it's almost a reading slump. Not that I don't want to be reading, but sometimes I'm doing other things instead of reading. But this week, I will have finished, as of right now, because I think I might do one more clip depending on what I read today. But this week, Monday through Sunday, I have read 6 different books. Now granted, one of those was a comic, which I'll talk about in a moment, and one of those was a novella. So they are smaller than some of the other books, but that's still a lot more than a lot of other people read. So my pace, my slumpiness is different than others, and I'll be the first to admit that. But let's get into the books. I think part of the fact that I have so many books to talk about right now was the fact that I knew that the next book that I needed to update about is this one. This is just such an incredible book. This is Minor Detail by Adina Shibley. I first heard about this book because of some controversy that was generated for how she was treated. She wrote this book, I think it was originally published in 2017, but this past year it won an award, and the award was going to be presented at a literary festival in Germany, and that festival was scheduled for the end of October. Well, as we know from the events that happened last year, there was the Hamas attack. I need to clarify. The Hamas attack on an Israeli kibbutz on October 7th. And this is a Palestinian author. And then there's the ensuing Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people under the guise of getting rid of Hamas. And this festival was scheduled to happen only a couple weeks after that. The controversy arose in the fact that the festival reached out, the festival was held in Germany, and they said, nope, don't come, we're not going to present this award. It wasn't that they were taking back the award. They might have considered it, but what they communicated to her was, we're not going to present this award at this festival, we're not going to highlight this. And people are like, wait, she has nothing to do with the attack that Hamas perpetrated. Her people, what she's talking about in this book is almost case in point as to a lot of the things that are happening right now in Gaza. And yet you're going to deny her this award because of what? The events in this book take place, so it's a dual narrative book. And yes, it's very short. It's about 112 pages. There was an incident that occurred, an actual incident, was covered in papers, and it occurred in 1949. And that was very early days of the state of Israel. And there were various malicious official parts of the Israeli Defense Forces that were going into different areas of what it is now confirmed to be part of the state of Israel. And they were basically trying to take over that territory that had previously been controlled by other countries, like the Negev desert, which is near the Sinai Peninsula, so it's near the border with Egypt. And they're going down there, and they were trying to establish control. And some of the ways that they were establishing control, not all that great. So that's the first part of the narrative. There was an incident that happened where an entire village, very small village group of people, because when you live in a desert, it's not going to be a very large group, were killed except for one woman who eventually there was SA and then her death. And I'm not going to say what it is because I mean, I don't get demonetized because I'm not monetized, but still, just in case. And so the second narrative in here is of a girl, because the first part is in third person, the second part is in first person. And this Palestinian woman read an article about this incident and she wants to follow up and find more out about it because this incident happened 30 years to the day before her actual birthday. And she was captivated by that coincidence. And so obviously neither of these things, so 30 years after 1949 is 1979. The events of this book take place decades before the current events. And yet they were trying to punish her somewhat or not support Hamas. I'm like, she's not part of Hamas. Nothing in this book has anything to do with Hamas. What are you doing? So there's a lot of outrage on her behalf. This book went on back order. So many people trying to get a hold of it. I purchased it. It took a while to come to me because of said back order, but I wanted to support her and I wanted to read this book. Now I knew that it would be a little bit out of my comfort zone because this is not necessarily the type of book that I generally read. I read a lot more mainstream fiction. I read a lot more full novellas, etc. This is different on both counts. And I'm so glad that I was able to read this book, that it was put on my radar. I am not glad for the reason that it was put on my radar. But things like this need to be read. So this book is called Minor Detail. Shibli uses details as that's the technique that she's using throughout her writing craft. The craft in here is phenomenal. But she uses details, like the narrative moves by telling every single detail about things, and things that seem absolutely mundane. They're very minor, hence the title, Minor Detail. With another writer, that would have gotten so monotonous. It would have grated on my nerves. It would have bored me, but I couldn't help but be intrigued by what she was talking about in here. And the way that she even talks about the details, she uses details in both sides of the narrative, I should say. But it's different because in the first half, it's third person, and second half, it's first person, but there's still those minor details that are being talked about. And it's almost like she establishes this and she establishes the story, and you know so much about what's going on with that because the third person narrative is from the point of view of one of the soldiers. It's almost like you know so much, you know so many details, but yet it feels like you don't know so much. And then you shift to first person narrative in the second half, and you're learning so much about so much introspection and how this works and how this completely shapes the way that people think when they're in these areas. She talks about all of these different checkpoints. I know that my own experience as a white American tourist in Israel this past summer, because the cruise that I took left out of Haifa, Israel, they're very different. They're nowhere near the same security experiences that a Palestinian living in Israel would experience. But I still remember one thing that stuck out to me when we were getting a ride from our hotel to the airport. The driver, even before you got to the airport, before you're getting in there, there was a checkpoint that he had to stop and communicate with the guard before you even got to the airport. And then once in the airport, there were like 5 or 6 different security stations, 5 or 6 different types of security in the airport itself. That was me experiencing this as a white privileged American tourist, not an oppressed Palestinian woman. So this just had such impact. It's going to stay with me for quite a while. I'm fairly certain that this is going to be a book that I talk about at the end of this year on some list that I have, some top 10, more than likely, because I have never read a book as impactful as this, as well written as this one is. So that one did not take me that long to read, and I actually read it as an audiobook. But it kind of, because of all the things that I had to say about it, kind of kept me from filming the updates, and then I just kept reading. I did continue with my updates, my written updates in my reading journal and on Storygraph and Goodreads. So I'm doing well on that front. But I'm going to pivot because all of the books that I have to talk about are nowhere near as serious as that one. The next book that I read physically, and that is The Odds of Getting Even. This is book 3 in the Moe and Dale Mysteries. This one felt like a slump. This one felt like middle book syndrome, even though it's book 3. And I think that's because it didn't really have its own standalone mystery. It plays off of the mystery in the first book, and I'm not going to go into those details, obviously because of spoilers. And I think because it didn't have its own standalone mystery that they're trying to solve, there's other things that they're trying to solve, but it feels all connected and drawn out from that initial case. I think that's what made this book read so slowly. It felt like there was far too much in this book. Like it could have been a lot shorter than it actually was. It read like a 400-page plus book. It was only about the same amount of pages as book 2. It had those quirks, those good things as book 2, but I didn't connect with it as much. Kind of disappointing. This just barely squeaked out a 4-star, and I think that's because of my love for the second book and the fourth book. I haven't finished the fourth book yet. I did get a hold of it on audio, and that is so much fun, but I'll be talking about that maybe later today if I end up finishing it today, which I hope to. Then we come to one where I was a little bit nervous going into it because I have read another book by this author, a YA fantasy book. I had an arc of it. I read it over the summer, actually on that cruise that I mentioned just a moment ago, and that is Palo Santiago and the River of Tears. I didn't necessarily intend to read another book by this author, but I do have this goal of trying to read through all the Rick Riordan imprints, the Rick Riordan Presents imprints books, and this is one of them. There's a series, I think it's a trilogy, and I think the third book is coming out this year. I have the second book. I may have an arc of the third book. I don't remember. But I wanted to pick up her middle grade book and see how her writing translated to the middle grade level, because it's not that I thought that her writing was bad in that YA book that I read. I think it was called Lucha of the Night Forest. There were parts of it that I really did not connect to, and it verged more into fantasy horror for a lot of stuff. But there was a lot about her writing that I really enjoyed. Her wordplay with the Spanish connected to the points that she was trying to prove. So I wanted to give this a shot. My difficulty with this is that the characters, this is my biggest difficulty, is the characters. They're supposed to be 11, almost 12, or 13. They do not read or act like they are that age. They read and act like they are upperclassmen in high school. But I think the fact that she is writing for a middle grade audience made her tamp down just a little bit some of that fantasy horror that she had in Lucha of the Night Forest. And so I really enjoyed this book. I don't, however, think that it is a middle grade book. I think some middle graders will enjoy this. I think a lot of them might. I don't think that necessarily that writing level is at the middle grade level. It takes considerable skill to do that, and not every author can, but I still appreciated that. And I'm definitely going to continue in this series. I'm going to read all of the Rick Riordan Presents imprints books. So this one is really intriguing me as to how she is going to continue to develop these characters, and whether as they continue to age, depending on how many years pass, whether the characterization of these characters is going to match more their actual age. The setup of this book, it's on Mexican more folklore than mythology, because the key character mythology folklore that this centers around is La Llorona. But La Llorona is a folktale about a woman who was in a really messed up situation, and because of that she ended up killing her own kids, but also then mourning them and constantly searching for them, and she's constantly crying. That's what Llorona means, the crying woman. And so it's based on that, and in there you have things like the Llorona, the chupacabras, and other more folk tale, not necessarily Mexican mythology. I did really appreciate that. I think Taylor K. Mejia has a fantastic grasp on all of this and weaving in all of this historical, the folklore, all the aspects of it. And I think the way that she portrayed the main character, Paula, was really intriguing as well, because she's the type of character where she is very much, she's Mexican heritage, but she doesn't really speak Spanish. She's grown up going in America, going to an American school. I think this is set in Arizona because that's where the Gila River is. And that's where that's the river, not the fantastical side. But I think she did a really good job in her portrayal of that. So I'm intrigued to see how this is going to develop in the trilogy. So I mentioned that I am reading the 4th book in the Moendale Mysteries by audiobook. The reason is because I picked up this book. I did not read it all yesterday. I picked up this book as part of the Pokeathon Gym because yesterday was the first gym in Pokeathon, which is part of Jade from January Reads Patreon. And this was a 2022 release. Technically, it released in 2023 in the US, but I knew because Goldsboro had it as one of their books last year before I had a subscription that it released in 2022 in the UK. So I knew about it. Becca from Becca in the Books has picked it up, has really enjoyed it, and I thought I would enjoy it as well. And so I started reading it. I started listening to it on my run yesterday, just a mile. And immediately I'm just like, hey, this writing is great and everything. I think the idea of the magic behind this embroidered book is great. I just really don't care to read more about these characters. So the setup is, it's 2 sisters. And these sisters, one of them goes on to become Marie Antoinette of France. I have read a lot about European history. I've studied it multiple times in my degrees. I've read multiple books on this, both fiction and nonfiction. I knew from Becca's talk when she was reading this book that Kate Hartfield does not change history. It's not alternative history. And so the plot beats of history and the things that happened to these people, to Marie Antoinette, to her sister Charlotte, that doesn't change. I'm like, I already know that. I don't necessarily want 600 plus pages, just more about them. Speculation, dabbling in the fantastical. And I decided to DNF it. I'm like, this is not a bad book. This is just not the book for me. I'm not intrigued with it. And just because I'm not intrigued with it, I'm not drawn to it, I don't want to spend the amount of time it would take to read a 700 plus page book just to be, 3.5 stars. In the past, I probably would have stuck through. I started it. I would have gotten fully caught up in the sunk cost fallacy. Not this time. So I won't be reading this. I read enough of it so that I can give a review, because I do have an arc of this on NetGalley, and I was just like, sorry, this is just not the book for me, so I won't be purchasing it either. And then the last book that I've read, I'm not going to talk too much about it. One of the prompts for Pokeathon Gym was a sci-fi. The only sci-fi book that I have on my TBR is one of the sci-fi books from the Goodreads Choice Awards list last year. I'm still like 4 weeks out on the audiobook, and I didn't think I'd be able to read a whole sci-fi book yesterday physically, so I picked up one of my Doctor Who comics. The thing about this is I don't read them in order, and so some of the later stories in the comic series I've already read, so I know where it's going with some of them. I would have really appreciated this art style throughout. It's not that art style, which totally fine, but it's fun, it's episodic, it's the Doctor and unique experiences, and I enjoyed it. Not much to say about it. I'm not going to get into the details. Obviously, it's my favorite Doctor. A lot of these comics have different companions than the episodes themselves, although Captain Jack is in this one. Sometimes they will have characters from, like, the actual companions from the show. Most of what I've read has different companions, which totally plausible. So I enjoyed it. Is it life-changing? No, it just helped me finish a prompt. Later today, I'm going to read the only other book that I have on my set TBR, my obligation TBR for January, and that is my Buzzwordathon book. I was born here, I was born there, or I was born there, I was born here. Those phrases go in one of those two orders. Plan to read that. Plan to, at some point today, continue reading The Law of Finders Keepers, which is book 4 in the Moe and Dale series. By the end of this week, I will have finished all of my quote-unquote obligation reads. Buzzwordathon 24 and 24, starting series, finishing series, continuing series, Rick Riordan Presents Imprint. Because I've read 2 of those. And then I think I'm going to focus the last 8 or so days on different Goodreads Choice Awards books, because I do have several audiobooks for those. Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, you have my next recent reads vlog. I'm actually starting this on Thursday, which is a little bit late, but I didn't finish any books Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I could have probably finished a book on Wednesday. No, I did finish them on Wednesday. I didn't finish any on Monday or Tuesday. Probably could have finished one on Tuesday, but I didn't feel like listening to my audiobook. My reading pace is kind of all over the place. My reading desire, I really want to read. I want to read all these books. I like my audiobooks, but I'm finding it hard to motivate myself to do, like, not watch the YouTube videos that I have saved up or whatever. So I'm going back and forth. I'm reading at a decent pace. If I don't end up reading as many books as I did last year, that's totally fine. I am still reading a lot of books. I'm looking over at the stack that I have over here. It's over 13 physical books, and I read 4 ebooks. So I'm still reading way more than a lot of other people. We shall see how that ends up settling out if I get back in the habit of reading more audiobooks. But I have 2 books to talk about. One physical, one via audiobook. And I'm going to talk about the audiobook first. So this week, besides the physical book, all of the books that I plan to read are from my, it's not necessarily a project, but it's all of the other books that I had that were on the Goodreads Choice Awards list. And so I've decided, it just kind of fell out that way that I'm reading historical fiction from that category. I have 3, maybe 4 from that category. And the first of those that I read is The Secret Book of Flora Lee by Patty Callahan Henry. So the setup of this book, it is dual timeline. Both of the timelines are in the past. So one of the timelines is in 1939, right before the Battle of Britain, when a lot of British children get sent off to the countryside. One of the other timelines is 1960. Point of view character for all of these chapters, except for some. That was a decision that I don't really think that we needed that at the point of view. The point of view character for this is Hazel. She's the older sister. Their father has already died. He was killed in a training accident. And so it's just their mom. And the age gap between Hazel and her younger sister, which is Flora Lee, is significant. Hazel is, I believe, 15 and her sister is 5 and then 6. But they have this really tight connection. And Hazel's a really good storyteller, and she makes up this whole world for her sister that does involve a river. It's sort of to comfort her sister. But then you have the present timeline, but the future-ish timeline from that. Flora Lee went missing. She had a stuffed bear that she loved, and it was found in the river, or in the shallows of the river, and the assumption was that she died. They never found her body. And of course, this brings up a lot of grief because Hazel feels really responsible for her sister dying, and she feels these complicated emotions with Henry, who is the son of the woman who takes Hazel and Flora in, because she had gotten angry at Henry and had run off with him, and like she really liked him. So she blames herself for her sister going missing. Both she and her mom have moved on with their life, but they never been able to say, yes, she probably died, because a body was found later of a small child, a young girl. Then at the opening here, she works in a rare bookshop. It's her last day there. She's going to get a job at Sotheby's. She's doing this one last job, putting these packages away. And she opens up a package, and in that package is a book, and she starts to read it. It's that secret world that she made up for her sister. And she didn't tell it to anybody else. She kept it secret for just them. And so immediately, of course, what she thinks is the author of this book is my sister. Maybe my sister is alive and I can find her. So that's what motivates a lot of this book. A lot of the times when reading this book, I saw what she was going for. There were some interesting angles that she took on things, but I never fully immersed into the story. I didn't necessarily see, well, I did see where it was leading, but I didn't necessarily see how she was going to get there, how she was going to resolve everything. And I think I was waiting to make my opinion on the book until I got to the end. It is the most sickly, sweet, syrupy, picture perfect, cliche ending. What happened to Flora Lee would cause so much trauma that needs to be unraveled and dealt with, and the circumstances in the 60s were not the way that they are now. The resources were lacking. A lot of the stuff was not talked about. And I just got to the ending and I went, are you serious? This is how you're going to end it. It is the picture perfect storybook fairy tale, the idealized version of a fairy tale ending. And then I read the author's note. And there's a couple things in here that rubbed me the wrong way. One of them was this part. While researching another novel, I was struck by a tidbit of 1939 British history. In Operation Pied Piper, children from large British cities were sent away from their families. Why is this just now when you're finding out about this? This is well known. Have you ever read Chronicles of Narnia? Very famous, influential series. That aspect of history is so well known. I'm like, you call it a tidbit? You didn't know it before? Okay. So she talks a lot about the Pied Piper and the legends and why they named it that way. I thought there was something else in this book that rubbed me the wrong way, but I think it was really that. And then just her emphasis on whimsy and fairy tales and etc. And she invoked Tolkien. So she knows about Tolkien, but she doesn't know about C.S. Lewis or Chronicles of Narnia or in that aspect of history. This was a flop for me. It's not poorly written. She didn't stick the landing. This is probably going to get a 3-star. I can't see it getting a 2.5 star just because the writing was solid and there were some good things about it. Just not the book for me. Then we come to the last of my obligation reads, and that was my Buzzwordathon book. The word is there, any of the versions of those. And this is a memoir. I was born there. I was born here. The author, born in Palestine in 1944, so about 4 years prior to the creation of the state of Israel. So most of his life, he has been stateless. He ended up marrying an Egyptian woman. They had a kid, but most of their early life, he had to spend away from them because he got kicked out by the Egyptian government. For what? I don't remember. He wasn't a political activist. He's a poet. This book is not told linearly. It moves around in a very, like, there's not a lot of structure to where things are heading in this book, in this memoir. It's almost stream of consciousness, but not quite. But the way that he writes is so lyrical, so poetic. Obviously, he's a poet. So moving that I had to read this book in small chunks. This is not a book, even though it's short, it's 213 pages. This is not a short book that I could just bang out, but it is so well done. There's a section, and I wish I could remember exactly where it is, that I was reading last night. And I took a picture of it because this is a library copy that I can't mark in. I'm gonna go grab my phone. And it's about telling stories and who gets to tell their story. The cruelest degree of exile is invisibility, being forbidden to tell one's story for oneself. We, the Palestinian people, are narrated by our enemies, in keeping with their presence and our absence. They label us as it suits them. The weaker party in any conflict is allowed to scream, allowed to complain, allowed to weep, but never allowed to tell his own story. So many times throughout this book, he was writing about his life, about his family's life, about his people, and the way they were made to live, that they were forced to live. Some of them in exile, some of them uprooted from their homes. And the way that this has been going on since the beginning of the creation of the state of Israel. And it's just not right. This book is an incredibly powerful story. The way that he wrote it, for me, a lot of times, non-linearity, not being chronological, usually forms a stumbling block for me. Like trying to say that word or make up a word. And my brain doesn't work with it, and so the narrative doesn't work for me. But this one, it really, really did. I didn't need to know the step-by-step, day-by-day, year-by-year chronicle of his life. This book has far more impact the way that he told it, because he's able to talk about the feelings, the emotions, painting the picture, the scenario. It's just so heartbreaking. And this is why we need to listen to people tell their story. And that quote right there, the way that the victims are portrayed, it's huge. It makes a significant impact. Once again, another really, really strong book. Okay, I'm here with the, I think, second and definitely last clip of this week's recent reads. Not as many books. I do plan to read another book today. It's Sunday. I want to do better about actually getting all the stuff filmed and edited and planned for the week, because I realized yet again for a second week in a row, I forgot to finish editing and then uploading my Saturday video. So I need to get better at that. Not that anyone's depending on my schedule, but I do want to be a little bit more reliable with that. So I'm going to do this last clip here, edit, schedule, etc. this recent reads, and then read today. Okay, I have 2 more books to talk about. So this week I read this book physically. Took a long time to get through just because of the depth of it. Talked about that in the last one. Read this one via audiobook and just wasn't as engaged, so it took a little bit longer to get through. Then I have one more that I read physically and one more that I read via audiobook. I started another one via audiobook and I'm trying to remember what that one was. So I started The Invisible Hour by Alice Hoffman. I think that's just litfic and it's not historical fiction as far as the Goodreads Choice Awards categories go. And then I have started, or will start a little bit later today, Wayward. And with this book, this is the last of the 4 in the historical fiction category for the Goodreads Choice Awards that I have read. I've read these 2 are also the historical fiction section. So I'm going to start with Let Us Descend by Jasmine Ward. So you could say that I had high expectations for this book, but it's not like I was expecting it to be a 5-star. What I expected was a very well-written book, a slightly different take on the historical aspect than what I got, because I'd heard really good things about her writing. She has won the Pulitzer Prize, I believe, with, let's see, she has won 2 National Book Awards for 2 of her previous novels. I think this might be her 3rd novel. I don't know how many she's written. So there's a level to her writing that I expected from this, and I actually got. But the style of writing and what was talked about in this book wasn't necessarily what I expected. Not in a bad way, it just wasn't necessarily what I expected. So this book is set in antebellum US. It's not ever said definitively when. It's close enough to the earlier portions of US history that the grandmother of the main character is the one who came over on the slave ship, who was stolen from her home. This particular character is the daughter of the slave master, the owner of the plantation on which she lived. There are some time periods with her mother who tries to equip her to survive and then gets sold off. And then shortly thereafter, the main character also gets sold off, and a portion of the novel is her journey to New Orleans on this horrible caravan, I guess you could call it. And then the last portion of it is at the new place where she ends up living. There's also magical realism tied in very strongly to this book. So I put in here that I really don't know how I feel about this book. I have not run it through compile yet. I finished this around midday or so yesterday. I'm looking down at my journal here. I also described the narrative as having blurred edges. And that's the best way that I can describe it, because when you're looking at the plot and trying to make your way through it, you know when things are happening, but at the same time, not knowing, you wouldn't know. And it was weird because there would be times where I'm going along, maybe I missed something, maybe I dozed off, but I don't think I did. And I would get to a point in the narrative and something would happen and I'd be like, wait, what, huh? How did we get from this point to that point? And I would go back and reread and I wouldn't see the connection. Like I would go back specifically to see what was happening. And it was just sort of blurred. And I guess you were just supposed to like guess at what happened. And that happened not all the time, but enough that I couldn't settle in to the narrative and necessarily understand what was happening. There's an ethereal quality to her prose in this book that I really enjoyed. The writing craft is not something that I usually read, and it was engaging to read it this time and intriguing, but at the same time, it made it so ethereal that it felt like it slipped through my fingers. You know, like my brain is trying to catch the narrative, and this was so fine and ethereal and vapor-like that I couldn't hold on to it. It just slipped through. And I think that's how I describe the book overall. My experience with it, I should say. I think I will hold on to this. I don't know what I will end up rating it, but this was a different experience than I expected. The one that I finished via audiobook, I finished last night, have not had a chance to write the review yet. This is one I was really looking forward to. This is one where this was an aspect of history that I didn't know much about. It's very timely. And even though this deals with Canadian history, it's very timely based on the things that have happened in the United States. So there's 3 different points of view, 3 different timelines in this book. One happens in, I think, like the 60s or 50s. Somewhere around there. I can't remember exactly. One happens in the 80s, very early 80s. And one happens about today, like 2017. And I will have to come back to this because my battery's blinking. So you have those 3 different timelines, 3 different women that you expect at some point will become connected. And they do. The earliest timeline, she is pregnant and forced to go to a home for unwed mothers. This was a wanted pregnancy. Her fiance had a heart defect, like they were like 19, had a heart defect, had a heart attack and died unexpectedly. So she really wanted this child. Her parents were super strict and were like, no, not going to do this. And at this home, the children, like the babies, were given up for adoption, forcibly or not. So that's the first timeline. The earliest, I should say. The timeline in the 80s is that a girl who finds out that she's adopted, but not because her parents told her. And this changes a lot for her, and she's also dealing with, I think it opens up actually when she's going with her cousin who has found herself unexpectedly pregnant and needs an abortion. And they have to go to a back alley place that's super not safe. There's complications for her cousin, and then that leads her down a road that connects her with the Jane Network. Now, the Jane Network, like none of the networks that actually existed in Canada had a specific name, but the author used that name. There was a network called the Jane Network in the Chicago area, but there were other networks that the author based her Jane Network on. But this middle character, Nancy, gets involved with that. The character that's the doctor, Dr. Evelyn Taylor, is actually the character from the earliest timeline. So you're starting to see how they're connected. And then the last character, the most recent timeline, Angela. She and her wife have been trying to have kids. They have suffered through lots of miscarriages, through different IUI treatments, and etc. She runs an antique shop. And she happens to find a letter that is addressed to the girl from the middle timeline. Like, it's from that girl's adoptive mother who's telling her that she gave her up for adoption and telling her, hey, I'm so sorry that I did this. You should go find your mom. These lines eventually all intersect. And for a while, there were parts of it that I was really, really engaged with and I thought was really intriguing. But I tend not to be a fan of these broad swath of history covered in one single narrative, where you're jumping each time you go back to that perspective. You're a couple years on, you're 10 years on, 15 years on. That tends to not be my favorite. It's not that it can't be done well. And I think that Heather Marshall did a good job with it. I feel kind of conflicted because at some points I'm like, this is intriguing, but could we not have picked like one of these storylines instead of trying to tell all of this complicated history in the same book? Then we get towards the end. I'm waiting to see how certain things come together in the present timeline. And Heather Marshall does something that I went, wait, what? Oh, I did not expect that. It's the kind of twist that you expect from a thriller. Almost. It's that abrupt, that shocking. And I eventually see how things come together and how that makes sense. There's a little bit too far of suspension of disbelief on how something could have happened to make this twist possible, and I don't think she explains that well enough. It did enough to get me re-engaged in the book, see where she was going with all of these disparate timelines. I still think it could have been tightened up and maybe not all of the timelines brought together. I think this was really intriguing, really thought-provoking. So this probably will be a book that I hold on to. So that means that from the start of this week, I have read 4 books, and all of them are fairly historical and not my normal genre. None of them are fantasy books. I have not read a fantasy book this week, which is remarkable for me. These are the 4 books that I've read this week, and we shall see how many more I get read before the month ends, about halfway through next week. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.